So this is me. I'm Phil Norton, developer at Code Enigma. I write on quite a lot on Hashbang Code, quite a lot about Drupal and things, so check it out. Also NWDUG organizer, that's Northwest Drupal User Group. So you may have seen me at a camp or conference in the past. So the source code for the talk is available online, so they're already synced to the web. And I've got a small demo, so all the code you can see can be found at this bit.ly address. But generally, all the information I have is on my website, so there's a mouse pointer in front of the QR code there. So yeah, what I tend to do is put a lot of stuff in the slides so that they can be reviewed later, so don't worry about furiously keeping notes because it's all online. But yeah, so Storybook, if you aren't aware, is a front-end tool for creating UI components. I haven't got my speaker notes up. So it's a sort of fully fledged web app. There we go. Fully fledged sort of UI creation tool with plugin system. I think they're on version 9 now. So if you look around on the Storybook website, you'll see examples of it like this. This is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with all of their components listed there. And we've already seen a couple of examples this morning of Storybook in action. And I've heard Storybook being mentioned at a few Drupal camps over the years, and my problem, I guess, with it is that it's always been a bit of disconnect. So there's, you build your stuff in Storybook and it's great, and then you then turn to Drupal and you've got to rebuild it from scratch in Drupal, which to me has been like, oh, I've got to do double the work then. So, but with single directory components, that's all changed. So you now build your components inside Drupal, and they're surfaced inside Storybook. So that's what I'm going to look at today. So why am I talking about single directory components? I think they're an important part of the sort of modern Drupal theme development. You'll probably see a lot more components coming into Drupal themes in the future. You can add them to themes and modules, so you can component your module bits into single directory components and use them that way. And the new Drupal Canvas system, which should be released in like this year, we think, integrates well with single directory components. So if you build them now, you can then use them inside your Drupal Canvas systems. So what I'm going to talk about is a small introduction to SDCs, or single directory components, and then look at it installing the Storybook module, and then finally installing running Storybook itself. So yeah, a very short introduction, because I could probably do an entire talk on this, but I'm just going to try to look at the basics, because some of the stuff I'm going to talk about inside the Storybook module doesn't make sense unless you know some context, so I thought it best to do this. So if you take any website, and seeing as we're at Edinburgh, I thought I'd do this one. So you can see that the University of Edinburgh website, this screenshot from a couple of weeks ago, has a load of things on it. You can separate those into boxes and componentize those. So you can imagine each of these boxes then is a thing that you would create as a component in your design system. And that's kind of the tenet of a SDC, really, is that it is a thing that you reproduce on your website. So an SDC then exists in a single directory, hence the name. And this is a component here, so we've got the component itself with a YAML file and a couple of theme files with it, and then a twig file as well. And these are all automatically included and injected inside your templates. So first, the component.yaml, sort of where you define your components, so you get the idea of slots and props. So a property or prop is then kind of defined as a data type object sort of thing. So here I've got extra classes, which is my property, and it could be a string or a null value. But then once I've got that in my component.yaml file, I can then include it in my twig template like this. That's fairly simple. Slots are kind of different. They're more for producing more complicated objects, so things like printing content with markup in it, or maybe introducing nested single directory components. Much simpler to define, although you can add types to the slots. But essentially it works in the same way. So I've got body here with a body copy there, and I can now use that in my template. There is a subtle line between props and slots, and I'm not entirely sure about the difference myself. Having a talk recently with 5 Drupal developers in a meetup, we had 5 different opinions, so if anybody has one to share later, then feel free to do so. But as far as I can tell, a prop is more for a simple thing that has a simple data structure. So things like title, perhaps, maybe classes, menu items, anything that has, a definite value, use a prop. If it's more of a complex object, like a body copy or a nested SDC, or for images there, so you can inject media items and things, anything that is a renderable array, that kind of stuff, use slots because it's much more resilient to what sort of thing you put in there. Also in your component library, component.yaml file, you've got library overrides, so this allows you to inject different libraries into your component if you need to do this through your JavaScript. And then in your twig templates, it's just a normal twig template really, but anything you define in your component file goes into your twig template, so that's simple enough. Only, this is an example of slots, but you probably shouldn't do slots like this. You should probably do them like this. So this is a block element inside twig. And what that does is it encapsulates that inside its own block, basically. Nothing to do with Drupal block. This is a twig block. But we'll come on to this sort of raw thing later. So you can override this at the storybook level and inject raw markup into this block without having to put raw into your twig templates, which can be a bit of a security problem. And then, any CSS or JS files that have the same name as your component are automatically included. But be aware that although SDCs are sold as, they should be self-contained, that's not necessarily the case because, especially if you render them Storybook, you get all the rest of the theme components in there as well. So you'll have all the stuff that's attached to your theme and, any modules, etc. As well. So I think although you should have self-defined SDCs, that's generally not always possible. So, and then you can also include other files, so templates and CSS. You can with CSS, you can do this sort of thing. So there's a post CSS action inside Drupal that converts that to the proper string. So you don't need to worry about where it is in your directory. It just sort of works. There's also this component metadata object which you can include in SDCs, and that contains a few different things about where the component is. So this .path points to that directory inside the file system. So it's a nice way of figuring out where you are inside Drupal. And then once you've done that, you can then include your SDC in the theme. So this is inside a theme file. I would drop this into the page, and I would print out various different things like this. So this is passing the body content to the body field, and then adding some classes that would be useful for the component. As a more concrete example, this is the author template. So this string here would be the entirety of my node template for this author file. So everything is then injected and then actually rendered inside the single directory component. So sort of creates this disconnect in a good way between your templates and your markup. The Storybook module then is fairly simple. It doesn't have any admin screens or anything, so You just require install it like any other module, and then because of the way that it provides routes, you can then add permissions. So I would recommend adding an anonymous permission to render Storybook stories, because if you think about how the system works, or look at how the system works, you can see this is a storybook, and this entire blue area inside here is actually rendered inside Drupal. So it actually connects to Drupal, renders things internally, and returns a result. So yeah, this path or this block then is provided by the Storybook module, and that's how the system works. Really, it's sort of self-contained. So once we have our components and the module installed, we need to provide some stories to connect the two together. So each of your SDCs need a stories.twig file, and this will contain examples of how the component is created or used, and you can also provide other markup and other interactions with this system. And it looks a bit like this. So this is a sort of basic storybook element. So you've got your stories element at the top here, and then inside here you've got a number of story elements, each of which defines, right here you embedded your theme template inside that, your SDC inside that, sorry. The important bit in the top bit here is the string here. So what this tells Storybook is that it will live inside components/example component, like this. So in the right-hand menu, you get this kind of structure which is copied from here. The more slashes you put in allows you to differentiate that a bit more, so you can put things down directory structure. Really useful if you've got SDCs in different themes or different places, or you want to segment them slightly. I think that's a good way of doing like that. The one default is a unique title, which is part of the story that comes from here. So these are used to name them in the folder structure. And the args here, so any args you pass into this string or array here are then reproduced inside Storybook. So these are actually interactable elements which you can, your users can interact with and change the markup inside your component. It's kind of a good way of playing with the component without actually refreshing the screen or doing any development work. Gives you sort of real-time access to the data inside your component. So as I was going on before about props and slots, so if you've got a prop or your component only contains props, then you're probably best off using include, because it's a simple include really, and you just inject your properties inside to the include mechanism there. For single directory components that have slots, you're probably best off using embed, in which you can then start overriding your block elements. And this is what I was talking about before. So our body has some raw markup in here, and we want to present that into Storybook as raw markup without adding the raw tag to our twig template, because that's a security problem. So we add raw inside our block here just to override the value on the fly, just for Storybook itself. And you can also add in multiple stories per file here. So this is number 2, wrapped. And this is the same component I had before, just with a different spin on it. So I've just added some styles. If you think about a component, it never exists on its own. It might be pushed around by other components on the page. This is a good way of sort of mimicking that action by giving it some borders and height and width and stuff. Essentially, is just the same kind of mechanism. And you can add lots of stories about how your component works and works with different modules and things. Depends on what you're doing with the component itself, I guess. Good news is that Storybook doesn't understand these stories.twig files, so we need to convert them to stories.json files, which is where Storybook can pick them up and start doing things with them. So the Storybook module has a couple of drush commands that allow it to do this. So there's generate all stories, which will just loop through all your SDCs inside your Drupal site, look for any stories.twig files and convert them to stories.json files. Good thing about this command is it doesn't regenerate them every time you run it, so it will only regenerate them if they've changed, which means we can do things like this. We can watch the directory, so every time you change it, it then refreshes everything inside your site. I've had this running with 50 plus components in a site, and it's taken a couple of seconds to run, so it's quite performant. It's good enough to be, fire up a terminal, set the command there running, and then just leave it for the rest of the day, which is quite cool. If you want to, you can also regenerate stories on their own, so you just generate stories at a component itself, and that will regenerate that component. But fundamentally, don't commit these stories.json files to your repo. They do contain information about site, including like the local URL. So what tends to happen if you commit those and push them upstream, it'll probably work, but you'll find weird little problems like cause errors coming through that you wouldn't expect. So it's best to regenerate them. If you want to push them upstream, is regenerate them when you build upstream. Some settings. So Drupal, you have to go into some settings and change some things inside Drupal to allow it to communicate. So probably your biggest problem will be cause errors, because we are calling from another application inside Drupal. So adding this to your development.services file will allow you to produce the right headers so that you won't interact with cause or cross-origin resource sharing stuff. And then, you add that file to your your settings.php file. Don't put these on a production instance, please. They are very much development settings, so you will, basically, this is a security-free zone. So don't be doing that on your production site, but definitely needed to allow Storybook and Drupal to communicate together. And if you're in active development, I would recommend turning on theme debug settings, which you can do through Drush using these 3 commands. Or what I do is just go to this page and click all the boxes inside development settings. So we should be ready now for installing Storybook. So I would highly recommend installing Storybook away from your Drupal repo or Drupal core site. There's a load of linting stuff built into Drupal that can get in the way or interfere with Storybook itself. So I'd recommend creating a test or a Storybook directory and putting it away from the web router there. And then npm init will generate a default package.json file, and then npx storybook init type server will ask you a couple of questions, but it'll get all the packages you need for Storybook. And after that, you should be left with a directory structure that looks like this. So .storybook is where all the configuration files for Storybook are kept. If you've opted into it, you can also get some example stories. I haven't looked at those at all, especially in this talk, but it gives you an idea about how you can start building your own components outside of Drupal. And then you've got your standard JavaScript node module stuff, which you would treat in the same way as any other JavaScript dependency. What we need to do, though, is open up storybook.main.js file and edit the stories line here to point to our stories.json files. So for every directory that has single directory components in that you want to test, you need to add another line here. So I've just got the one theme, but you might have one in a module that you want to test, or multiple themes you want to test, in which case add more here. And that's about it. Yeah, the themes don't have to be active, or the modules don't have to be active. They just need to exist, and Storybook will pick them up. And then because Storybook is a JavaScript application, we can just run it on its own. So we can just npm run Storybook, and that will fire up Storybook as a as a a JavaScript application inside this address, Storybook localhost port 606. If you're running inside DDEV, there are some things you need to do to run it inside the web component, but you can do that if you want. But what I tend to do a lot as well is build Storybook as a standalone site, so you can actually build a static Storybook site, which you can then deploy just normally as on your web root. And that is quite good at demoing SDCs to clients, because you don't need to install a Node application, server running. You just need to point your Nginx at the web root like this. So this just, if I go to Storybook-static on my Drupal install, I should get the Storybook install alongside my Drupal install. There are some couple of other things to do. So any files that aren't specifically controlled by Drupal, you need to allow this again is cause bypass. So just allowing that header to exist for static files is useful. But then, that should be good to go. So the workflow then for doing all this stuff together is, you start building your SDC. You then create your story for your components. You then run or build Storybook to make sure it's available in there. And then really, I develop inside Storybook. So my development is then looking at Storybook and my IDE and developing inside there. And then only once complete does it actually get into Drupal. So although Drupal is required to, a Drupal installer is required to build the SDC, it doesn't actually become part of the theme until later on in the project. So let's demo some of this. This is going to work. If I can get it onto the right screen. There we go. So I've got, so this is my PHP Storm install basically. So I've got my main file that points to my stories files. So that's just configuration thing. This repo, by the way, is available online. A link to in the docs in the talk README. So yes, you can download and run this yourself and have a look at how I've done this. I've then got my development settings set up here, and then I've also, because this is DDEV, I've got some DDEV options here that allow me to run Storybook as an application inside DDEV. So it's all sort of packaged together. I've also got the Nginx rules at the bottom that allow me to run Storybook as a static site as well. And then inside here, I've got like a standard component. So I've got my components, and here's my stories. So this is just some basic markup with the bits and pieces in there, and this is the file that gets generated. Doesn't look like much, but it's basically a JSON representation of the story. So the repo also comes with, I've got a make file. I love self-documenting things. So the make file will tell you all the commands as well as like a suggested order of operations. But what I want to do here is generate our stories. So that will generate a bunch of stories, and you see it skipped those because it's already regenerated. So I don't need to run that again necessarily, but I can then build my Storybook install, which will then, if I go up here, it generates this directory here, which contains Storybook as a self-contained directory. And I think it was make launch Storybook static. Yeah. So here's my Storybook install with my default property here. I can come in here and edit edit the content quite freely. So this is a great way of providing user interaction. In fact, several of the demos, especially on early stages of product development, are basically looking at Storybook. I don't even bother with Drupal. It's just demonstrating the fact that we've done work inside Storybook to produce these components. This is the same component with that red border that provides the. You can tell I'm not a front-end developer, can't you? But yeah, so this contains a couple of examples. So I've got a star rating system here that's got a slight variation where you can input a number, and so I can increase the number like that. And the template for this is fairly simple. If I go back to it somehow. So all we're doing is counting the number of stars that introduced, and then just incrementing the number of filled or not filled stars available. So, we can provide stories about each star in turn. I can also introduce titles to the rating. This is actually a component from a live project as well, so with names changed. But I can also, in here, what we do is provide classes that change the functionality of the component slightly. And although you can provide this as a string, I've actually done this as an option, so I can allow you to turn that on and off on the fly as you will. And then there's a couple of other things, just showing all the examples of different types of components involved, and then a style guide, which is kind of useful as well. So let's look. That actually seemed to work. Okay, good. So some tips. So look for cause errors. So all of that stuff. Probably the biggest challenge is getting the two platforms to connect to each other properly without lots of errors. So if you open up Storybook and it's a blank screen, then look at your console errors. If it mentions this word cause, then you've got a connection problem between the two, and you need to introduce that allow access control header. If that's not the case, then look inside your Drupal logs, because this is a rendered entity inside Drupal, so any errors will produce Drupal logs, hopefully. So you should see some validation problems inside that. As I said, don't commit your stories.json files. Storybook loves to cache, especially the build stuff. So if you've regenerated your stories and nothing appears to be happening, like try a different browser, go into incognito mode. Trust me, it'll work. And I've not looked at the Storybook plugins in this talk at all, but there's loads of different things you can use. So I think we saw an accessibility checker earlier, so you can probably install loads of other things to see how your component interacts and reacts. Just be aware that Drupal will wrap things in extra elements. So, as I said before, your SDC doesn't live on its own. It will be part of a Drupal page. So if you find a bug that's caused by it being wrapped in a absolute positioned element, that's kind of the sort of thing that you need to write a story for, so that you can check for that in the future. Good way of unit testing your stuff. Understand props and slots. If you've got any opinions, let me know. Set up a style guide Storybook. That's a good way of demonstrating all the different things that your theme can do outside of your stories, outside of your SDCs. You wouldn't necessarily use that SDC inside your theme, but it's a good way of demonstrating your font headers and things. Don't abstract too much with single-directed components, so don't drill down into like a link level stuff. Although it seems like a good idea at the time, on a recent project, I think the link element was perhaps the most complicated SDC we had, because sometimes it needed to contain markup, sometimes it had extra classes, sometimes it needed an external link identifier. So depending on your use case, I wouldn't go too deep into SDCs in terms of abstraction. But conversely, don't try to cover too much. So don't try to replace the entire page structure with STC. That's not what they're for, really. It's for individual bits of the page that you might reuse on other pages. So if you're editing the entire page.twig file, that's probably the wrong thing to do. You need to drill down slightly lower. Some alternatives then. So if you don't want to muck around with Storybook, you don't have to. So this is STC component library. So this is a nice way of showing components inside Drupal. So this is inside a Drupal admin area. And you can click on the right-hand side here and just left-hand side and click into your different SDCs. So this is an example of the author component running on its own there. It's also got a built-in accessibility scanner, which is quite nice. There's single directory components style guide. This is a slightly less stable module, I would say. As an example, this background with the hashed effects isn't in my theme. I don't know where it's from, but it seems to come from the module itself. So, and a few things tend to break if I click down the side. So yeah. As an alternative as well, Storybook has an SDC add-on plugin. So you can actually build SDCs inside Storybook without ever having to go to Drupal in the first place. So there might be an interesting sort of upside-down way of doing things, but it certainly gives you the possibility of building an SDC inside Storybook, without ever having to touch in Drupal. So if your front-end themers are more familiar with Storybook than are with Drupal, maybe this is a good start for you. But some resources. These are links, by the way. You can click on these. But yeah, so there's Storybook website itself, the Storybook module. There's lots of documentation on Drupal.org, quite a lot more than some other bits and pieces about SDC, so worth going and have a look. And then I've written about the Storybook module and previewing single directory components on my site. So yeah, there's plenty to read about there. Any questions?
Thanks, Phil. That was a great talk. When you're using Storybook, what have you found it to be useful primarily as a dev tool, or have you used it in facilitating say cross-functional kind of collaboration with the rest of a team?
Primarily as a dev tool in terms of building the STCs, but then, as I said, I've been in demos where we haven't even looked at Drupal. It's just been showing off the STCs inside Storybook, and that's been useful for the client as well, because they can take that and show it to their shareholders and things, and go, look at these components we're starting to build, and we know that when we built them in correctly, as it were, inside Storybook and STCs, that when we drop them into the site, they work in the same way and they're useful as that. So not necessarily from a collaborative point of view, because I think most of the developers I've worked with on this project especially who've all been involved with Drupal development and things. So I'd be interested to see stories on using Storybook with other teams and things, but yeah.
Nice. I thought that the tip on not drilling down at the link component sounded really interesting, and one to consider as well. Just working with Storybook in Drupal, have you used it outside in any different stack? I just get the impression from using it outside of Drupal that maybe using it with just Twig is kind of like using Storybook with one hand tied behind your back a little bit. In that it's somewhat limited in what you can do. For example, I think there's some unit testing. Have you had any joy with creating unit tests for components?
We were using Cypress to do our kind of behavioral testing, but we had the Cypress behavioral testing plugin, visual testing plugin, and what we did is we pointed it at Storybook and got it to scrape the pages inside Storybook as a way of testing Storybook components on their own. But in terms of using Storybook on its own, I've not really touched it much. I mean, I'm not probably using it to its fullest capabilities, really. But
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
I know what you mean
that
about
makes sense.
one-hand time to hide it back, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's plugins you can use to
Unit test
to
it.
add more stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you just have a little bit more flexibility. Say if you were building like React component or something, you could maybe just use Jest or something, but maybe that's not a Storybook issue.
Yeah, I mean, you could potentially, because the main.js file, you can point to your stories in your Drupal site. You can also point to them externally, I guess. So you can have a mixture of outside and inside components. But your inside components would be built from, things inside your Drupal system that the Storybook module would render for you.
Nice. I think I'll ask you a bit more about that later.
Right.
Sounds interesting. Cheers. Thanks a lot, Phil.
Okay.
Thank you. One more question, and then we're going to move on to the next.
To swap.
I was just also going to respond to Paul's question about collaboration. In my experience, it's really good for collaborating with developers, but the cause security issues that you talked about means that I've never felt brave enough to run it on a web server to show a client or something like that. So that's definitely something to consider. And just on the props and slots, I think your description is accurate, but at the moment things don't seem to be enforced.
Yes.
So if you use the wrong one, there doesn't seem to be kind of any consequence. But I think in general, slots are for things with markup, and props are for discrete pieces of information where you know the data type,
Yeah.
like a string or something.
As a good example, we had a menu system built with props because we thought the title would always be a string. But if you have a path that the user can't get to, Drupal will swap that for a translatable object with a string inside it, and that crashes your prop because it's not a string anymore, it's an object. So it's much more versatile, but generally probably a better approach for markup and things like that. So agreed.
Okay.
Am I out of time?
Thanks again.
Thanks.